Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Asche. I'm the Senior Researcher at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. And I want to talk a little bit about our State of Rural report. This is something we actually publish annually every year. And it's just kind of a quick highlights of demographic and economic trends happening throughout rural Minnesota. Essentially, we compile all the data that had been released over the previous year. We take about 2 weeks and we go through population, migration, and race and ethnicity. We look at the economic vitality of regions throughout the state, talking about top employment industries, percentage of jobs in government, job vacancies, and income maintenance. And then we talk a little bit about ag as well, just because of the role it does play throughout a lot of rural Minnesota. And we compile that into a report. We call it the State of Rural in Minnesota. One thing I know is that there are multiple organizations and even state agencies that seem to have their kind of typical compilation of all the data across the state. And they all kind of do this highlights of demographic and economic characteristics throughout Minnesota. I think what makes ours a little bit more unique than a lot of the other ones is that we tend to have a lot of our stuff through a rural lens. And a lot of times we'll use, for example, these RUCA categories, which is rural urban commuting areas. And so we'll actually break the state into 4 different categories: counties that are entirely rural, a town-rural mix, urban town-rural mix, entirely urban. And what's interesting about this kind of breakdown is that not only does it include population in terms of its classification system, but it also looks at commuting patterns. So if a county that might be very rural, but 30% of its labor force goes to, let's say, a more urban area to work, then that linkage may make that county that was very rural to be a little bit more town-rural or urban town-rural mix. And we feel like that kind of identifies a little bit more of a lived experience for a lot of folks in rural areas. Instead of thinking of it just as a static county that's just rural, there's all these connections made, and there's all these ways in which we're interacting with each other. And so that's why we use these RUCA categories. And I want you, as we kind of move forward here, I'm actually going to break down some charts using these 4 categories. So kind of form a mental image in your mind of this map where the counties are. And as you'll see, most counties in Minnesota are not at the extremes. We're not mostly entirely urban, and we're not entirely rural. Most counties are somewhere in between that spectrum. Again, kind of why we like this classification system. One other thing I wanted to point out is that the data you're going to see over the next few slides was actually data collected over 2020 and 2021. So this is data collected during the pandemic. It was released throughout the year of 2022. And so this data always has a lag, but it's really particularly interesting this year because it's the first data that we got to see coming out of the pandemic and some of the impacts that it had. And what's interesting as well is usually the State of Rural report is like we do it over 2 weeks. It's kind of minor changes. We update a percentage here, update a percentage there, but they're long-term trends. They don't change drastically over time. They change slowly unless there's a huge disruptive event, such as a global pandemic, that makes things change very extraordinary and very much off the charts in terms of any sort of trend. And so that's what we saw. And again, the State of Rural has a lot of different components. I'm just going to pull out one piece that we all in the office thought was, wow, this is pretty incredible, and wanted to highlight it today. And you can go to our website, ruralmn.org, to take a look at the entire report and get the fuller picture. So the one piece we're going to pull out is this: is it real? A shift in population patterns. And this is where things got really interesting. So there's 2 drivers of population change in a county or in an area. There's natural change. Are you having more births than deaths? Then you have a positive change in population. If you have more deaths than births, then you're going to have a negative population change there. The other driver in population change is migration change. So you either have everybody has in-migration and out-migration. The question is what's more? Are you having more people come in than go out? Then you have a net in-migration. Vice versa, you have a net out-migration. And so these next charts, I know they look kind of crazy. Don't worry about it. We're going to step through these a little bit. But I want to show these are what's called the annual components of population change. And so you'll see these 4 charts here, and I'm going to kind of move my cursor around so you can kind of follow along. We have entirely rural, town-rural mixed counties, urban town-rural mix, and entirely urban. And you'll see we have our 2 drivers of change here: natural change and migration change, and then total population change. This red bar, let's start with entirely rural. For natural change between 2010 and 2019, that's this red bar here, entirely rural counties lost, on average, 189 people per year, meaning there are 189 more deaths than births on average between 2010 and 2019. During 2020 and 21, significant change. We had a lot more deaths than births, 401. But this was throughout the entire state. We saw this, more deaths than births. You'll see our town-rural mix used to have more births than deaths, but during the pandemic had more deaths than births by a lot. That's a pretty significant change. Actually had 1,200 more deaths than births between 2020 and 2021. Urban town-rural mix, again, 24 more deaths than births when they used to have 3,600 more births than deaths. And then even entirely urban was cut in half compared to what it was between 2010 and 2019. And again, it's really easy to see why this is, right? The pandemic caused a lot of death, sadly, and it was true. And I think, too, we had a lot of people thinking about family planning. They didn't want to risk having a pregnancy. Going into a hospital is a really weird time. And so people just weren't planning on having pregnancies. They were kind of thinking ahead. I think, too, there's a sad part about the deaths, but we can kind of make light of it, too. I think some of us were thinking, we're all stuck at home. There'd be a lot more oopsies, but that wasn't actually the case. And so this kind of what we had from 2020 to 2021, a major significant event. Now let's talk about migration change. And this one was really kind of interesting. And I think for a lot of counties and county leaders and township leaders, you probably heard from real estate agents, maybe with your own eyes, like, man, there seems to be a lot of interest in moving rural. We're seeing a lot of people kind of move into our areas. And finally, we got to see the data. And finally, we can say, yes, the data is quite clear that what you saw and what you heard and maybe what you felt is accurate. So let's start here again with entirely rural in this top left corner, and you can see our entirely rural counties at an aggregate typically had an outmigration of 275 people per year between 2010 and 2019. Between 2020 and 21, they gained 518 people in migration. This is a huge change. I mean, it's a total 180. Again, from like a statistics perspective, this stuff is pretty wild. You just don't see changes like this happen or occur over the course of 1 year. So really, really interesting. You can see our town-rural mix typically lost about 1,000 people a year due to outmigration. They gained 2,600 people between 2020 and 2021. Our urban town-rural mix went from gaining 205 to 5,500 between 2020 and 2021. And most surprisingly is our entirely urban areas lost. They had an outmigration of 18,000 people compared to a gain of in-migration of 10,000 or about 11,000 people they had the previous decade. And even more interesting, I don't have a chart on this, and you can check out on our website. We did a blog post on this. We have entirely urban counties in our outside of the 7-county metro, places like Blue Earth County. When we separated those out and looked at entirely urban counties that were outside of the 7-county metro, they actually still had an in-migration of not a ton. I think it was like 1,500 people, but the 7-county metro lost about 20,000 people between 2020 and 2021. So it really was kind of a 7-county metro issue in terms of the out-migration. So what does this all mean for total population change? Well, our rural areas saw total population change at the aggregate level for the first time in 10 years, at least. So you can see the total population change. The in-migration was able to perform the decline in natural change. So there was actually an increase of 112 people compared to the annual loss of 500 people they had in the previous decade. Town-rural mix here on the upper right went from 217 annually to 1,400. Urban town-rural mix went to 3,700 to 5,600. And again, entirely urban lost about 7,000 people in total population change compared to the usual 34,000 that they gain. So really, really incredible stuff that we don't typically see. So what does that mean? So obviously, this is a chart looking at population since 2010. Essentially, anything that's in the yellow to orange to red means that they have a lower population kind of today or in 2021 than they did in 2010. What's interesting about this map is that there's quite a bit of blue, and this is actually way more blue than we saw just 2 years ago. There was a lot more yellow, orange, and red on this map 2 years ago. And so the in-migration just over the last few years was able to put some of our counties into a more positive. And so these are those counties. So these counties that have the blue stripes through them meant that 2 years ago, they actually had a lower population in 2019 than they did in 2010. And by 2021, they now have a higher population in 2021 than they did in 2010. Again, these are fast changes. These are counties such as in West Central there, we're looking at Grant, Swift, and Chippewa. In Southwest is Brown, Watawan, and Rock. And in North Central, it's Wadena, Todd, Morrison, and Mille Lacs. These are counties that just 2 years ago had a lower population than they did in 2010. And by 2021, they had a higher population. So those are kind of like the big pieces that we had from the state of rural. There are a lot of interesting elements. I encourage you to take a look. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the economics, particularly in employment here in just a second, but I do want to pause if there are any questions and answer those if needed.